My role is to use data modeling and analysis to evaluate the environmental impact of media technology and services, which of course includes BBC Radio. So today I'll be taking you through a recent piece of research we completed looking at the energy footprint of BBC Radio, both as it stands now and how that might change in the future. So over the next 20 minutes or so, I'll give you an overview of what we did, how we did it, what our key findings were, and what steps we're going to take forward. So please feel free to submit your questions, and hopefully I'll be able to answer these towards the end of the session. Apologies in advance if you hear any sirens or honking. I live on a really busy main road. Hopefully you won't. So what were we trying to achieve in doing this research? So our main objectives were to understand how much energy is needed to prepare, distribute, and consume BBC Radio. So not just what the BBC is directly responsible for, but also in the consumption of content. And then we wanted to understand how this energy use might change over time. So if we were to switch off certain platforms in the future, what that could have on the total energy. And lastly, we wanted to understand where in the system are those key hotspots. Where do we need to focus our efforts if we want to reduce our energy footprint? So how did we go about this? Our research was split into two key parts. Firstly, our baseline, so trying to figure out what the situation is as it stands today. And for this, we actually used the reference year of 2018. And then we wanted to look at the future energy use as well. So we modeled 4 different scenarios over a 20-year time period. I'll introduce what those are later for you. And as you can see, we've not just included live content within our scope, we've also included podcasts and other on-demand services as well under that radio umbrella. And just to give you an overview of what the BBC radio system looks like, so this is kind of a map of BBC Radio from the point of production to the listener's ears. So we've not actually included production in our scope, but everything that happens from that point. And as you can see, we offer a range of different platforms. I'm sure you're all familiar. We've got AM services, including medium wave and long wave, FM, DAB, DTV radio services on terrestrial, satellite and cable, as well as our internet infrastructure as well, such as BBC Sounds and other places where BBC content is hosted. And essentially what we did for our methodology is translate this system map into a mathematical model. So each of the boxes you see here has its own self-contained set of equations, which outputs energy on a monthly basis. So this really allows us to hone in on where the key hotspots are and at what times. And what we primarily feed into the model is user analytics data from Radar, as well as BBC internal data, energy data from our suppliers such as Arqiva. So essentially what we did is translate this system map into a mathematical model. So each of the boxes you see here has its own self-contained set of equations, which output data as well as from academic literature. So using academic literature primarily to look at the energy modeling of the IP network, for example. And with such a complex system and unavoidable uncertainty regarding future behaviour and changes to technology, modelling such a system can be quite challenging. So to combat this, we've used a range of different statistical techniques, including the Monte Carlo method. So each of the 400 or more model parameters which we've included within this are not represented by a single value, but instead represented as distribution with a mean and kind of an uncertainty range associated with that. And then what we do is run that model over 10,000 simulations to try and get a range of values in which the true value may lie. So that's how we've handled uncertainty. And I'm often told that modelling is an imperfect science, which is somewhat true. I guess it doesn't strive for perfection, but it exists to kind of help us understand what the dynamics are in a system and give us a kind of best guess. So in order to understand these dynamics, we've had to make a range of different assumptions regarding future behaviour, as well as some other unknown parameters. I won't go through all the assumptions we've made because there have been quite a fair few. But an example of this would be the radio receiver power consumption figures that we take in have been based on our own sample of measurements. So the UK government previously did a comprehensive study on radio set on and standby power between 2010 and 2013. But even in that 3-year time period, those figures changed quite dramatically, and so they're really now quite out of date. So as well as kind of being in a COVID time and kind of the resource constraints we had, we took it based on a sample of about 20 radios and have done some kind of sensitivity on analysis on that later to kind of test whether that's a reasonable assumption that we've made. And if you wanted to understand more assumptions, you can look at our paper later. So I've got a poll available. Hopefully you can all see the poll and you might be able to answer it. So I want to ask you, which platform do you think has the biggest energy footprint? We have fairly high confidence in the results that we've got for our baseline, except those radio power consumption figures that I mentioned. So which platform do you think has the biggest energy footprint? AM, FM, DAB, DTV radio, or IP radio? I don't know if you're voting. I can't see anything. Hopefully you are. I don't know if I'll be able to see the results either. I'll give you a few more seconds. Okay, people are voting apparently. That's good, exciting. Hopefully somebody can tell me what you said. Otherwise I might have to reveal that to you later. So I kind of want to close the poll in 3, 2, 1. Okay. I can't see any results, but before I get any idea of what you guys think, I'm going to come out with, it depends. So it depends on which granularity are we looking at. Are we looking at the total energy over a year's time, or are we looking at per hour of listening for that particular platform? It also depends on which devices people are using to access that platform. So for example, for IP, are you listening on a smart speaker or a smartphone, for example? Or for a TV, do you have a set-top box associated with that while you're listening? So there are a lot of dependencies, so it's a little bit of a trick question, but that might be a bit unsatisfactory for some, so I will delve into the baseline results. Oh, they have come through to me. Okay, so I've got AM 24%, FM 11%, DTV 7%, DAB 6%, and IP 53%. Very interesting indeed. So let me present those results to you now. So this graph here shows us the total energy use per platform in 2018. And at the bottom, we can see the total energy for all the platforms put together. So in 2018, there was about 325 gigawatt hours of energy used for BBC radio services. And to put that into a bit of context, that's about 0.1% of UK energy use that year. And actually, as you can see, FM at the highest energy use at about 31% of the total, and AM the lowest at about 8% of the total. And when we're looking at where in the system are those key hotspots, you can see that consumer devices were shown to have the biggest impact, taking about 3/4 of the total energy. And this is kind of consistent across platforms, except for AM, where the distribution was actually slightly higher. You might be wondering where the blue on this graph is. Preparation is so small that you can't see it. It's less than 0.1%. So that's playout encoding and multiplexing within that. And this might be quite a surprising result, as transmitter networks are often assumed to be the most energy-intensive part of the chain. But actually, it kind of makes sense, because even though the power of the consumer devices are really small on an individual level, when we scale them up by the tens of millions, you can see how this can really add up. So when we looked at where the key hotspots are within the system on a more granular basis, we saw that the three biggest components driving this energy use were analog radio sets, DAB radio sets, and television sets. And just those three things use more than 50% of the total energy in the system. And when we zoomed in even further, what we see is it's that the standby power of radio sets and smart speakers are driving this energy use the most. And earlier I did state that we had quite a high uncertainty around the radio set power figures, so we tested whether these were 50% higher or lower than we'd estimated and what impact that would have. And what we saw in the sensitivity analysis is that if they were both 50% higher or lower, it affected the energy by about 20% of the total. And what we consistently found, even in all these situations, was that the consumer devices were still the biggest contributor by far within the system. However, not all listening on each platform is equal. So this graph here shows the unique device hours per platform per month. As we can see, in 2018, sorry. And as we can see, FM is the highest, followed by DAB and IP, and AM and DTV by far have the lowest listenership for radio services. So perhaps a better way to put energy into perspective would be to look at the energy use per hour of listening for each individual platform. And when we do that, we actually see a very, very different picture, where the energy use for DTV is about 81 watt hours per device hour, and the energy use for DAB, which is the lowest, is 9 watt hours per device hour. So essentially, DAB uses 1/9 of the energy per hour of listening that DTV radio services do, which kind of makes sense, because if you're listening to the radio on a television, you'll have a TV with a screen associated with that, and perhaps also a set-top box, both of which are quite high-powered devices. What's also interesting, though, is that the FM uses about 40% more energy than DAB per hour of listening, even though they've got fairly similar kind of setup and infrastructure. So this is primarily due to the FM network using more energy than DAB, the transmitter network, sorry, and that DAB radios tend to have a slightly lower standby power than the FM radios that we tested. So this just kind of gives a summary of the baseline results I've just presented to you now. Our paper gives a much more detailed breakdown if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty. So I really suggest you check that out. I think there's a link available to it on your second screen. Otherwise, there'll be a link to it at the end of this presentation that you can make note of. So jumping into our scenario results, before I do, I should probably give you a rundown of what the scenarios we actually looked at were. So we chose 4 indicative scenarios to test our modelling capability. It's worth noting that these are for illustrative purposes and do not represent the intentions of the BBC. So as you can see, we've got business as usual, so keeping on all platforms that we offer now for the next 20 years. And then we've got our digital-only case, so switching off all our analogue radio services from 2030. We've got our DAB and IP only, so switching off analogue and DTV radio services from 2030. And lastly, we've got our IP only offering, so switching off absolutely everything else except IP radio services from 2030. Bear in mind, we've kind of assumed there to be a sudden switch off happening from 2030, kind of happening overnight, instead of kind of a gradual process, which is what we'd see in reality. And what we've done is, at this point of switch off in 2030, we've assumed that if the platform that somebody is listening on has been turned off, they would move to an alternative platform. And what we've based that switch, or which platform that they would move to on, is where they listen to radio. So radar analytics data kind of has that information, and we've done some matrix multiplication in order to inform that. So I've got a second poll for you. Hopefully you can see this one now. So which scenario do you think has the smallest energy footprint that we've calculated here? So business as usual, digital only, DAB and IP only, or IP only? I'll give maybe 5 seconds from now because I'm running out of time. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, if you want to close that, sorry, that was quite a quick one. I might get those results trickling in a moment, but I will proceed. Oh, they're kind of being written to me. I'll proceed anyway and dish those back to you at the end. So we're looking at the business as usual case. As we can see, there's very little change in the total energy over that 20-year time period if we were to do nothing differently. So the average energy use across this time period is about 323 gigawatt hours. So only 2 gigawatt hours less than our baseline from what we saw. We do see within that there is some kind of dynamics. So there's a decrease in energy use for AM and FM devices and an increase in energy use for IP devices, primarily due to smart speakers. And we're seeing this because we've kind of built into our model some projections of kind of what the popularity of certain devices will be over time based on a report that we had commissioned. So that's kind of what we're seeing there. And of all the scenarios we looked at, this was shown to be the worst outcome. And actually, only 1% of you thought this would have the smallest footprint, so you obviously thought that would be the case too. And then looking at the digital-only case, so as you can see, there is a slight reduction in energy compared to business as usual. But actually, this was the smallest reduction that we saw of all the switch-off scenarios that we modelled. So despite there being this overnight removal of AM and FM infrastructure at 2030 and device use, we only see a 0.03% drop in energy at that point of switch off. And that's mainly due to the kind of gap being filled by a greater uptake in DTV radio listening as well as smart speakers. So we ran a bunch of different configurations of which devices people might switch to when analog services were turned off. And we found that there could actually be a greater, or there could be an increase in the total energy if more people moved to DTV radio, and that there could be an even greater decrease if more people moved to DAB. So messaging around kind of device migration would have an impact on the energy use if we were to turn off analog radio services. And then looking at our DAB and IP only scenario, where we switch off analog and DTV radio services, we actually see the biggest energy reduction from our modelling, about 23% drop at that point of switch off, which is mainly sustained for the remaining period. So of all the scenarios we looked at, this is actually the biggest reduction in energy that we saw. And then moving on to the IP-only scenario, where we switch off everything else from 2030, we do see a reduction in the energy, but it's only half that seen in the previous scenario, where we also keep on DAB, and we're kind of not seeing as pronounced a drop because, as we showed earlier, DAB had the smallest footprint per hour of listening. So if we're replacing it by other devices, we can see why there's not as stark a drop in the total energy. And the magnitude of this drop here that we're seeing for IP only kind of really depends on which people switch to. So if more people were to take up smart speakers than what we estimated, then we could actually not really see much energy reduction at all in this situation. So here kind of shows us all the switch off scenarios compared to business as usual. And kind of the energy saved from them. So as we can see, all the switch off scenarios showed energy saving potential, but to very different magnitudes. And that retaining DAB and IP led to the biggest energy saving by far, almost twice as much as for the IP only. However, it's really important to remember that these aren't exact predictions of how much energy will be saved, and that the results will be really dependent on kind of future changes to technology and kind of strategic decisions that might be made and messaging to consumers as well. However, we wanted to see what potential interventions could affect our results. So as we showed in our baselines, the standby power of radio sets and smart speakers were by far shown to be the biggest component driving energy use. So we thought it would be interesting to model the energy consumption if standby power of radio sets and smart speakers was set to zero from 2021. So essentially, what impact everybody removing their devices from its power source would have on the total energy if everybody were to do it. And what we see is that if we were to do this, we could see a potential saving of 38% in the total energy in the system. And although completely removing standby energy is unfeasible in practice, it shows us that any reduction in the standby power would see significant energy savings. And there's kind of three key avenues in which we could see this change and intervention be implemented. And that's through regulation of consumer electronic devices, through manufacturers reducing the power consumption of their devices, particularly standby power, as well as through audience behaviour and the public, perhaps also collaboration through the radio broadcast industry, kind of encouraging users to keep their devices or turn their devices off when they're no longer in use. So this just kind of, to summarise, that means from a sustainability perspective, we shouldn't really carry on as business as usual. And of all the scenarios we looked at, we showed that keeping on DAB and IP led to the best outcome in terms of energy use, and was actually the most robust under which different devices people might switch to at that point of switch off. For the other scenarios, the results were highly dependent on which consumer devices people moved to once a platform was switched off. So the messaging around that, if we were to adapt our strategy, would be really critical. And probably the really key thing I want you guys to take away is that the standby power of radio sets and smart speakers is really significant. So we would really want to encourage reductions through all possible avenues. So that's through regulators, manufacturers, and listeners. So thank you very much for listening. Please feel free to get in touch via email if you wanted to discuss any of this further. Please do check out our full paper. That's kind of you can plug that into Google or whatever, and you should be able to pop that up.